Peace be with you. Friends, our gospel for today is from the wonderful 14th chapter of Matthew, and it's his account of the calming of the storm and the walking on the water. This is an event that reached very deeply into the hearts and minds of the first Christians. We can find an account of this in all four gospels. And, obviously, this sort of thing would have just turned them upside down. And they began to reflect on this extraordinary event in very deep ways. By the time the Gospels are written down, what you have is, it's a combination now, and there are two schools. One wants to go one way, one the other, and they're both true. What I mean is, this is an historical account. It's an account of something that happened. So don't think that this is just a made-up story with a moral meaning. No, this happened. But once it happened, the Christian community began to reflect very deeply on the event and pull out the different levels of meaning associated with it, so that when it's finally written down, let's say Matthew's gospel is around the year 80 or so, when it's finally written down, what you have is not a newspaper account. If you're a good journalist, you just give me, who, what, when, and all that. Just tell me exactly what happened, or it's simply a photograph of an event or a film. That's one thing. But what you have in the Gospels is not so much that. I would call it an iconic representation. It's a real event, but it's now being presented to us in an iconic way so that we can see all of its theological and spiritual implications. So that's my principle. Now, where did I learn this? From some newfangled scripture scholar? No. I learned this from Origen and Chrysostom and Jerome and Augustine, the great church fathers. That's how they read these texts. Okay, so let's look at this text iconically. And what do we see? After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Now, the disciples in a boat, that's code. The disciples in a boat is a symbol always of the church. That's why we speak of the barque of Peter, right? The ship, the boat of Peter. The apostles, the immediate followers of Jesus in the boat, symbolize the church. And once you see that, the Gospels begin to open up in fresh ways. Then listen, after doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Okay, what did the early Christians intuit now about the Lord? The risen Lord has sent the church out into the world. So think now of the ship, the barque of Peter, and it's setting out onto the waters of space and time. The church is now sailing out into the world. Where's Jesus? Well, he's not in the physical sense in the boat with them. Where's the physical Jesus now? Well, he's not here physically among us. Where is he? He's on the mountain praying. A symbol here, it seems to me, seems to the church fathers too, of the ascended and risen Christ, now in the heavenly place, interceding for the church with the Father. What's Jesus doing all day? Well, he's guiding his church. He's interceding for his church with the Father. So think of this now as an image for all of us. It's 2,000 years later, but we're all in the barque of Peter. We're in the ship of the church. We're making our way through the waters of space and time, and Jesus, ascended and risen, is interceding for us. Okay? When it was evening, he was there alone, he, Jesus. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, listen now, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. Again, did this really happen? Yes, they're describing a real event, the storm at sea, but now we're reading it with these theological and spiritual lenses in place. The barque of Peter, making its way through space and time, sometimes is on smooth water, smooth seas. But very often, and even the most casual student of church history knows it, very often the church goes through storms. The wind is against it. Now, we've heard just in recent weeks, reading the parables of Jesus, there's an enemy at work. Yes, there is. We have enemies both visible and invisible, and they stand to thwart the purpose of the church. There's our own corruption, our own stupidity. There are the enemies that we can see who oppose themselves to us, et cetera, et cetera. All of these forces kick up the waves and make the sailing of the ship dangerous indeed, perilous indeed. Again, go from the time of the apostles all the way up to the patristic period, into the Middle Ages, into the modern period, into our contemporary world. What do you find? The church being tossed about by waves. I referenced it, I think, last week or a couple weeks ago. We've all just in this country been going through a very stormy time with the scandals that have rocked the church. The barque of Peter, yes, was taking on water. The barque of Peter was up against very strong waves. During the fourth watch of the night, now this is code for the darkest time of the night. It's always darkest before the dawn, right? So the darkest time of night. It's night and it's stormy. If you feel the church is going through a rough time, it's right at this moment. The disciples saw him walking on the sea, and they were terrified. I mean, they remembered this so vividly, this fact of Jesus walking on the sea. But let's read it theologically and spiritually. The church is being buffeted by waves. They're afraid, of course they are. At the darkest time, Jesus comes walking on the stormy waters. See, notice not only managing to swim in them. Let's say that you got the strongest swimmer around, the strongest, human figure is able maybe to swim in stormy seas. No, he's not just doing that. He's walking on the water. Go right back, everybody, to the opening verse of the entire Bible. When there's the tohu vabohu, we hear, the stormy, the watery chaos. And the Spirit of the Lord hovers on the surface of the water. This is the creative power of God, listen, bringing order out of chaos. When the Israelites come up against the Red Sea, through the power of the Lord, that sea is split and they're able to walk through it. So here, the divine Christ is able to walk even on the stormiest waters there are. Praying for his church, yes, indeed, all the time. Also, intervening when the church is most threatened with his divine power to master even the worst crises. See, we're meant to take an enormous comfort in this. Notice, though, please, what precedes the comfort, if you want. They saw him walking on the sea, and they were terrified. See, this is the proper response to the power of God. As I say, if you saw a powerful, human being swimming in the stormy waters, you say, "Wow, that guy is impressive," or "Wow, maybe he can he can survive this." But when you see somebody walking on the stormy waters, you're not dealing with an ordinary human agent. But you're dealing with the power of God. What's the proper response to the power of God? It's terror. It's and not a terror that's debilitating, but it's a keen awareness of the transcendent power that we're dealing with. It's wonderful. It's the fear of the Lord, if you want, that gift of the Holy Spirit. At once, Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Again, this is biblical code, isn't it? This is Matthew's gospel, but you find this especially in John. The Greek there is ego eimi, which is I am. I am. See, it is I. But what he's saying is an echo of Exodus 3:14, when Moses asked God, "What's your name?" And in the Greek of the Old Testament, he says, ego eimi hoon. I am who am. I am the one who is. My name is I am. So the power here, everybody, is Jesus announces to them his own divinity. And it's only in that divinity that we are going to find salvation in the stormy times of life. If we start turning toward human figures, I don't care who they are. They're philosophers, they're theologians, they're pop stars, they're political figures. Forget it. Forget it. That's not going to save us. The only power capable of saving and sustaining the church is ego eimi. I am who am. It's the divinity of Jesus. And isn't it lovely? He says to them, take courage. Don't be afraid. Where's courage come from? I mean, real courage, not from worldly figures. It just doesn't. I start relying on these worldly figures, I will necessarily be disappointed. Where does the courage to be come from? It comes when we borrow from the divine Christ something of his divinity, when we participate, yes, even in the stormy times, in his divinity, we find courage and we find peace. Now, wonderfully, of course, Peter, as he often does, speaks for all the other apostles. The successor of Peter is still the leader of the church. So Peter speaks to the Lord. Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. Jesus says, come. Now remember, we're still in the storm here. Think of the church at its darkest, stormiest times. Jesus says, come, come. And then Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. This is exactly now what I was talking about, that we borrow some of the power and the courage of the divine Christ. And then we are able, yes, even to walk on the stormiest waters. How do we get through these times? Don't rely on ourselves. You know, everything in our culture says me, me, me. My prerogatives, my choice, I'm so great, I'm perfect in every way. Forget it. That's a spiritual dead end. Or, oh, I better rely on these political people, they're going to save the day. Or, oh boy, these, just these revolutionaries. Forget it. None of that will allow you to walk on the water. It's only the power of Christ, the divine Christ. And then this, beautiful detail. So Peter's walking on the water toward Jesus, looking at the Lord. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. It's a simple point, but very important spiritually. When you're in the midst of the storm, we're in one right now in the church, God knows. You're in the midst of a storm. Look not to the waves, but to Christ. It's always a temptation is to look first at what's threatening us. I know, it's an instinct. It's a deep animal instinct in us. Look at what's frightening us. I better be careful of that. No. Keep your eyes fixed on Christ. And then you can continue to walk. The sinking comes when we turn from his divine power to what's threatening us. And then how beautifully it ends. Jesus stretched out his hand, caught Peter, and said to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And they got into the boat, and the winds died down. There's Christ who, up and down the centuries, as the barque of Peter crosses the waters of space and time, saves his church. And look how it ends. Those who were in the boat then did him homage, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. They got it. See, it's one of the moments when they realize we are not dealing here with another Jeremiah or another Isaiah or another, Abraham or Jacob. No. Nothing as trivial as that. What we're dealing with here is the God of Israel. We're dealing here with the Lord God. And so the proper response is not just to admire him or thank him, but to worship him. Mind you, my fellow Christians, when we stop doing that, we've lost our way as a church. When Jesus becomes just one more little interesting prophetic figure among many, forget it. We are going to go under the waves. But see, when we trust in his divinity and his power, we do him homage. Even we can walk on the water. And God bless you.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. And today we're joined by the main man, the main event, Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome,
The
Bishop.
main event. The Muhammad Ali of evangelization.
You know, I need to come up with like a creative entrance theme, like wrestlers come out with the smoke and the music and the,
Yeah.
you got your
How
like
about you
special moves.
Get your big brain around that one. You could work on that.
A couple exciting things happened recently. One of them is that your interview with Jordan Peterson finally went live. And
Yeah.
listen, to all of our fans, it wasn't our fault it took so long. It was in Dr. Peterson's court to release it. We're sorry it took 3 or 4 months to come out, but it's finally here. You can listen to it at wordonfire.org/Peterson. What are some of the early things you're hearing from people who have listened to the interview, Bishop?
Yeah, good. I've gotten a number of emails and stuff. One thing that they all say is, and it's typical of Peterson's podcast, it's long, and it was his show that I was on, so I wasn't in control of that. But it was a wide-ranging, lengthy conversation, and people say, gosh, I needed so much time to kind of process all that, and it should have been broken into 2 parts or whatever. I said, well, I know that's his way of doing it. But, I enjoyed that. He's obviously a super bright guy, and we both have a sense of the Western intellectual tradition, and a lot of that came out. But no, I got a lot of good feedback on it.
Well, I want to use that as a springboard into today's topic. We're talking about the odd extra strategy of you and Word on Fire. We're going to define that here in a minute, but this is so important to what you do. You've, from the very beginning of your evangelistic work, you've focused not as much on internal church issues and debates and questions, but you've gone out into the culture to engage with people like Jordan Peterson. And, we're going to talk through this interview about other things you've done, the interviews you've done, the places you've spoken at. Why is that your mission?
Well, it's an evangelical mission. Go out to all the nations and declare the good news. Urs von Balthasar distinguished between those 3 basic offices, right? The Petrine, the Pauline, the Johannine. The Johannine is more the mystical, contemplative, the prayerful life of the church. Petrine is the official side of the church's life. Think of bishops holding office or a pastor in a parish. And the third one is the Pauline, and Paul going out, right, into the Greco-Roman world and going out to meet the pagan society, speaking at the Areopagus, crowds, Jews and Gentiles throwing stones at him. And that's the missionary side of the church's life, the evangelical, the intellectual, the one that engages the culture. Well, the minute I read that in Balthasar, I thought, yeah, my life's been largely Pauline in form. That's been the form that my ministry has taken. So Paul was an odd extra sort of guy. Think of the fact that Paul rarely stayed in the churches that he founded. He would found them, get them going, and then he'd go and establish other ones. Now, write letters back to the ones he had established, but he wasn't going to just stay there now for the rest of his life and govern that church. That's an evangelical kind of impulse, is to be on the move. And also, as I've spoken many times, Acts 17, Paul on the Areopagus, that's the model in many ways. Go into the public space of a culture where ideas are exchanged, where points of view that are very different from the one that you're proposing are dominant. And that's where you go. So that's the odd extra Pauline missionary sort of focus. That's the one that I've kind of naturally gravitated toward.
Let's define these terms that we've thrown about here, not only in this episode, but in the past. Odd extra and odd intra. What do we mean? What's the difference?
Yeah, so 2 simple Latin phrases. You'll hear the one at a papal conclave, when it's time to lock the door, and the master of ceremony says, extra omnes, right? Everybody out. Extra is outside. So odd extra means looking toward what's outside. Odd intra, on the other hand, looking toward what's on the inside. So is it a more exterior approach or a more interior approach? What comes right to my mind here is Pope Francis. In the speech that everyone says got him elected Pope is when he, at the general congregations before the conclave, he talked about a church that goes out from itself, a church that goes out from the sacristy, that allows the sacred oil to run down to the edge of the garment. I love that image, and the oil becomes rancid if it's kept to itself, but it goes out, That's the ad extra style.
Now, the way that I read your work over the last several years is early on, you were sort of in ad intra mode. You were a seminary professor teaching seminarians at Mundelein Seminary for many, many years. But then at some point, it seems like your mission just almost dramatically shifted to being this great evangelizer of the culture. Was there a moment when you just felt a new mission or a sense from God that this is what I'm supposed to do with my life now? Or did you just kind of more fall into that?
Well, it's more of an evolution than a revolution. But, and I want to make a clarification to suggest that odd extras, that's really cool, and odd intra is bad. I don't want to give that impression at all. In regard to the church, the turning within, well, that's necessary. As you say correctly, Brandon, for a long time when I would give talks and lectures and retreats and days of reflection for priests, it was ad intra in a way. It was looking at the church, trying to encourage the church in its work, trying to teach, seminarians and priests. Good. There's nothing in the world wrong with that. It's great. But I think, by the end of the 1990s, maybe, so around the turn of the millennium, I sort of made that transition as I started doing work in radio and then on internet and then videos and television, et cetera. So, I think I began to sense the need for that. And, it's deeply grounded in Vatican II. Vatican II was very much of an ad extra council, it seems to me. I'd say, but more of an evolution than a revolution.
Let's talk a little bit more about Vatican II, because I think depending on one's reading of what Vatican II intended or how it played out, it may be intended to be this great ad extra council, but as we've seen over the last 50 years, the wake of it was this inward focused interchurch debates and discussions about authority and sexuality. What happened there? How did we get off track?
I think it's one of the great ironies. And I've been speaking about that for a long time. Cardinal George and I often talked about it because Cardinal George said, I think quite rightly, Vatican II was a missionary council. John the 23rd, as he called the council, said, we don't have a lot of inner things to resolve. We don't have great doctrinal debates. So go back to Nicaea, Chalcedon, Council of Trent, for example, Vatican I. There were great intellectual doctrinal issues that needed to be resolved. Or at Trent, so many of the practical issues coming up out of the critique of the reformers, right? At Vatican II, John the 23rd said, we don't have those. But what he intuited was, we need to get out from behind our high walls. So we've been cultivating this life behind these high walls, and now it's the time to bring the lumen to the gentes. I'm purposely using the Latin for the lumen gentium, right? The light of the nations is Christ. The church is the vehicle of that lumen. So now let's go. Come on, let's, the universal call to holiness, the missionary demand, the new evangelization, all that comes out of Vatican II's vision. But, as you say, the irony is, in the wake of the council, especially in the West, that didn't happen. Instead, we turned, I'd say, much more inward and then intensely debated those issues largely of sexual ethics and I'd say ecclesial authority. Now, mind you, important issues, absolutely. People of goodwill all across the board engaging those, absolutely. I'm not for a minute denigrating that. But I don't think it was the purpose or intention of the council for the church to turn inward to a resolution of its interior identity and so on. It was to go out, to the world. I think that was, in my mind, there's an awful lot of the agenda of Vatican II that's radically unrealized. Years ago, I was at a priest conference and a priest said, Father, isn't it time for Vatican III? And I said, oh, God, no, because not that there will be a Vatican III or something someday. There'll be another council. But I said, we've barely begun to realize the ideals of Vatican II. And I still think that's true. One of them being this, the missionary outreach. Now, the golden thread from, let's say, Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes, through Paul VI, into John Paul II, into Benedict XVI, all the way to Francis. Look, read Evangelii Gaudium if you doubt me on this. That golden thread is the outward move of the church. That's the ad extra.
Why do you think it is that despite a major council like this and popes ever since it concluded emphasizing the need and urgency for this ad extra mission, that so many of us nevertheless focus on the ad intra questions? Why is that?
I'm sure there are many reasons, Brandon, but my guess is because it's easier. I'm saying the ad extra move, it's a tougher move. It's a tougher move to go out and really engage the culture. It requires a shared effort. Again, remember last time we talked about the scattering and accusing quality. When you turn inward and you start debating the church's inner life, that's fertile ground for all this accusing and dividing and so on. But together, we're going to go out to meet the culture. Together, we're going to go out to announce Christ. That's tougher. That's tougher. And I think the devil loves to draw us into this internecine, bickering and dividing and accusing. So that's part of it. I think it's just tougher to get our act together and go out to meet the world.
Well, in the rest of this episode, I want to talk about some of the responses and criticisms that you've received in your own ad extra work. You're one of, if not the most prominent figure doing this ad extra evangelistic work. So I want to talk about some of these experiences. One of them is that you've gone to a lot of places within the past year that would not be sympathetic to Catholicism. So for example, the campuses of Amazon, Facebook, and Google. You've had conversations with Ben Shapiro, who's an Orthodox Jew, Dave Rubin, who's an agnostic in a same-sex relationship, Jordan Peterson, who is a massively controversial figure across the board. What do you say to people who discourage you from talking with these sorts of people because they might believe or hold things that aren't in alignment with Catholics?
I'd say take it up with Jesus and Paul. I mean, I'm just doing what I'm told. The Lord said, go preach to all nations. He didn't say, go preach to people that will agree with you. He didn't say, go preach to your fellow believers. He said, go preach to all nations. Take it up with Paul. Paul in the Areopagus, is he talking to people that will naturally agree with him? Paul goes into a synagogue and they throw stones at him. Paul goes out to any city he comes to. I mean, we've been doing this from the beginning. And it's been the charge of the church because we have the missionary obligation to preach to all nations. Tell Thomas Aquinas, as he engages the work of Aristotle, which, believe me, did not make him popular with a lot of people in the 13th century that thought he was diluting the wine of the gospel with this fetid water of a pagan philosopher. So, I mean, this is an old problem. But I take it up with Jesus. He told me to preach to all nations. And so I can play it safe and just talk to my fellow believers. And again, I've done that a lot. I have nothing against speaking to my fellow believers, but that's not the evangelical strategy. So I think, you got to do it. Is it messy, painful, dangerous, sometimes getting you in trouble? Yeah, but read the Acts of the Apostles. Pick up any page of the Acts of the Apostles, and you'll see messiness, danger, getting in trouble, maybe not doing it exactly right. Think, for example, again, of the famous Acts 17. One way to read that is Paul gave his speech on the Areopagus and then realized, no, that wasn't the right way to do it. I need to – then we hear Paul saying, I preach one thing, Christ and him crucified, right? All right, that's the way it goes. Sometimes you're going to hit a home run. Other times you might get a solid single. Other times you might strike out. But I think we can't be afraid, oh, I didn't say it exactly right, or, oh, that didn't go exactly how I wanted it to go, or, boy, I got a lot of critique. All right, you're in the arena, So was Paul, and so were the evangelists up and down the centuries. So I guess that's my argument, Brandon, is take it up with Jesus and Paul.
One related problem that I see in the general culture, this isn't only with your experiences talking with these people, is the assumption that if person A appears on stage with person B, then person A must de facto agree with everything person A has said or done or stands for. We saw this with your USCCB presentation, which we talked about last week. Even the mention of one aspect of Jordan Peterson's work that you admired generated this whole outcry of people who said, they're fellow travelers, they're allies, they're walking on the same path. How do you respond to this sort of assumption?
Well, it goes with the territory. Sadly, I think of my great intellectual hero, Robert Sokolowski. Philosophy is the art of making distinctions. And people, man, have they lost that art of making the right distinctions. And that's one of them. Like, okay, he's on the stage with this guy, and they're having a conversation. It doesn't mean he's now an ally of this guy. He's an acolyte of this guy. He totally approves of everything this guy's ever said and done. I mean, come on. That comes up. Maybe we'll get to it, but it comes up in you review a movie, because you find something that's evocative of the gospel in it. Oh, therefore you approve of everything every character in that movie has done. I mean, come on. Aquinas used Aristotle. Oh, therefore he subscribes to every single teaching of Aristotle. Well, obviously he doesn't. And he was eminently clear on that score. So it's that globalizing thinking, that's a failure to make the relevant distinctions. It's annoying, but it's also par for the course. But you can't let it stop you. See, Brandon, actually, I bring to prayer a lot when I do my holy hour, and I pray about the work that I do. And you can't let it stop you. Because, again, that's, I think, part of the devil's strategy is to say he wants to get in the way of evangelizing the culture. And that's a way to do it. So, again, he'll stir up division and accusing and bickering in order to block the work being done.
I know another criticism that you've sometimes received, because we've seen it through emails coming into Word on Fire, is that you strategically only talk to conservative or right-leaning people, and that you don't appear on an equal number of left-leaning platforms. Is that true? Is that part of your strategy?
No, because first of all, nego majorem. I mean, I deny the major premise. It's a false premise because, as you mentioned earlier, Brandon, I've been to Google headquarters. Now, say what you want about Google. A bastion of conservatism would not spring to mind. I've spoken at Facebook headquarters. Say what you want about Facebook. Bastion of right-wing ideology would not spring to mind. I was up at Amazon headquarters in Seattle. Say what you want about Amazon. So it's not true that I've just spoken to right-wing people. I've spoken to all kinds of left-leaning groups, and if they give me a platform, I'll go. They won't censor what I'm going to say. They won't, at least to my face, mock me. I mean, I'll go. So no, it's not true that I just speak to right-wing people.
What would you say to people listening to this interview, maybe members of the Word on Fire Institute, maybe young evangelists who want to follow your footsteps into this ad extra mission? What encouragement would you offer them, and then what cautions?
Well, as I've said many times before, if you want to do this kind of work, read, and then begin to read. You know what I'm saying? Is that you've got to be prepared, knowing the intellectual tradition of the church. Because if you're going to get into this space where you don't expect a sympathetic audience, if you've got a really sympathetic audience, you can get away with a lot, let's face it. I mean, because they're assuming a lot of the same things you are. So you're making your argument, and maybe you're making a pretty bad argument, but they like you and they sympathize with you, so they're going to, they'll accept the kind of soft edges of your argument. Well, not in the odd extra space, where they are programmed not to like you. They probably have powerful disagreement with you. Their instinct is to think you're wrong. Well, your arguments better be pretty sharp then, They're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And so to go wandering into that space, unarmed and unprotected is not wise. If you might be full of goodwill. Boy, I want to declare Jesus Christ and I'm full of love, and that's great. That's great. You should be full of love. But you got to be full of brains too, and you better have your arguments straight, or you're not going to get very far. And in fact, you'll do damage to the church because you'll look stupid and you'll look unprepared, and people will say, "Oh, there it is. There's the church. Doesn't know what it's talking about." So that's my first thing. I'd say get yourself, prepared and armed and intellectually adept at this thing. The dangers, go back to Balthasar. He saw in each of the three missions, the Petrine, Pauline, and Johannine, there were typical dangers. The Petrine is he said, petrified. That means that in your official status, you can become so geared to the law and to order that you become, tyrannical. The Johannine side, you can become so into the liturgical and the prayerful that you become uncritical and superstitious. Now, the Pauline danger is rationalism. So you're so eager to engage the culture with argument that you can drink the Kool-Aid, or you can go over to you can go native, as I used to say, that you can become as rationalistic as your opponents. And you forget the discipline of the church, you forget about prayer, etc. So rationalism is the great danger of those who take the Pauline path. It's dicey. When you're engaging in that world, heck, I've heard so many, you have too, of course, so many arguments against religion. I hear them all the time. Well, that can take a toll on you. If you're not prepared and steeled by prayer, etc., you can start to say, yeah, maybe that's right. So it is a little bit dangerous to go into the odd extra world unless you're prepared intellectually and spiritually and morally.
Can you say a little bit more about the spiritual preparation? I mean, for yourself, with all this work, critics online, whatever, what do you do spiritually to prepare yourself for that and to secure yourself afterward?
The holy hour is the key to me. And this morning, I'm an early riser, so I spent an hour in prayer in my chapel. I pray part of the office during that time. I pray the rosary typically during that time, the Jesus prayer. To me, that's the key. I also ask whenever I meet a religious community, especially of contemplatives, I'll ask them to pray for me. So I get people, and I'll say, pray for me in this work that I have, because it's dangerous. It's difficult work. But I think my own prayer, Brandon, is the key. Not that I'm not susceptible to these temptations I've been talking about. I am. Anyone that does this kind of work. I think Paul was. I think Paul faced some of that difficulty. And then, the criticism. If you're in the arena, some will cheer and some will throw rotten vegetables at you. Okay, that's what it means to be in the arena. And see, if you're in the arena, no matter what you say or don't say, you'll get vegetables thrown at you. Right? So one option is get out of the arena. And that's, okay, leave the odd extra thing. Get out of the arena. And then you probably won't get critiqued. But if you're in it, just expect it, period.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. Today we have one from Catherine, who lives in Pennsylvania. She's asking about Jesus and his healing miracles. So here's Catherine's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Catherine, and I'm from Pennsylvania. I was just calling in to ask, why is it Jesus always tells people who he has healed not to tell anybody about it? Thank you so much. God bless you and have a great day.
That's a good question. It speaks to what the scholars call the messianic secret. So Jesus is the Messiah, and he tells his disciples in many cases that that's his identity, but then he's quick to say, now don't talk about it. Or as you say correctly here, when he'll heal someone, now don't spread this word around. Now they usually do anyway, right? But they think the reason is this, that Jesus knew that his messiahship would be interpreted almost necessarily in a political direction. And so once they got the idea, oh, this is the Messiah, and we hear in one of the Gospels, they tried to make him king, They wanted him to lead the rebellion against Rome. They would read it politically. And so he wanted to keep it secret so that they would see what kind of Messiah he would be. Now, I think one of the most eloquent things is in the Gospel of Mark, where the messianic secret's very powerful. No, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. But when does someone say, for the first time, unambiguously, this man's the Son of God? The centurion, when Jesus in death can no longer say, don't tell anybody. Now tell everybody, because now we see what real messiahship looks like. It looks like the suffering of the cross, right? And I think that's the church's message, is that now we indeed proclaim Jesus, Mashiach. That's all Christos, Christ means, right? But we do it because we know the cross and the resurrection. We know what kind of Messiah he is, so we don't have to keep the secret anymore.
Well, thanks so much, Catherine, for that great question. If you have a question, be sure to visit askbishopbarron.com. And before we go here, this whole episode, we've been discussing the ad extra strategy of Bishop Barron and Word on Fire. If you'd like to help us with that, visit the website wordonfire.org/unaffiliated. It's a new website we put together that highlights all of these initiatives we've been working on, from the discussion at some of the major Silicon Valley headquarters to cultural influencers and movers and shakers that Bishop Barron's been engaging. The thing is, we've mentioned before here, all that stuff takes time, energy, and money to pull off. Just the audio video requirements alone are pretty expensive. And if you'd like to help make more of this happen, to help Bishop Barron engage more with this Ad Extra mission, we invite you to join us by supporting us at wordonfire.org/unaffiliated. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show. Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. And joining me as we get ready to start the great season of Advent is Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron, good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon, always good to be with you. And again, I'm happy with this scenario now. We can see each other as well as hear each other across the country.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Pretty amazing that from Florida to California, it's crystal clear audio and video. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
Well, we're recording this just a few days before Advent. This episode will go live right after Advent, but just a couple days ago, you celebrated your birthday, and you had a big birthday party there out in Santa Barbara. Tell us about that.
Oh, it was lovely. I was down in LA for some meetings the first part of the day. Then I came back up here. I just had a great little gathering with mostly my staff people up here, and we just had a lovely dinner and exchanged some presents, and it was delightful. I don't like getting older, though. I must say, I like my birthday less and less as I get older.
I saw you had a little cake with a bunch of candles, and you got all of them on the first blow, which is always really good.
Yeah, more or less.
Well, listen, again, as I mentioned, we're just starting the great season of Advent. I guess this year, starting on December 2nd, we've got 23 days here until Christmas. And so that's what I wanted to focus on during this episode. You've done a lot on Advent themes over the years, but we haven't done a podcast on it. So maybe we start off with this, Bishop. What is Advent, and why should Christians embrace this season?
Well, I'd say, it's the Adventus, so the coming of the Lord. And so think of three comings of the Lord. Historically, so 2,000 some years ago, when Jesus came, think of his coming at the end of time, right? We wait for his second coming. And then in between, we wait for his coming now into our hearts and minds. See, in a way, all of Christian life is an Advent season, isn't it? Because it's all about welcoming the Lord into our hearts. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And so we're always saying, come, Lord. He came 2,000 years ago. He will come definitively at the end of time, but then in between. And that's actually an interesting concept. The church is the French call it the entre-temps, the in-between time. That's the time of the church. In between the first coming of Jesus and his second coming is this intermediate Advent season where we are preparing for the coming of the Lord into our hearts and minds. So in a way, the themes of Advent are universal. They're year-round themes. They describe the life of the church every moment.
Now, you've said in your writings and videos on Advent that one mistake that a lot of us Christians make is we tend to see both Advent and Christmas as sort of these cozy, sentimental seasons. But you say instead we should see them as a preparation for revolution. What do you mean by that?
See, because Christmas, Advent, really anything but cozy and sentimental. Again, I got nothing against sentimentality. I mean, I have sentimental feelings too about Christmas around the fire with your family, and all that is terrific. Nothing against it. But Christmas is all about the arrival of a new king. So to put it in a biblical framework, Israel is waiting for Yahweh himself, God himself, to come and rule as king. Think of Israel now in its long history of oppression and invasion and domination. Israel longs, and you hear it, don't you, in the Psalms, you hear it in the prophets especially, Israel longing for the day when Yahweh himself will come in the person of the Messiah to reign over Israel. Now, is that a cozy situation. No, that's a revolutionary situation. When God comes to reign, that means the old kings and the old kingdoms fall away. That means a new order has arrived. Do you sense it in the Gospels? Absolutely, don't you? That with the arrival of this kingdom, and Jesus uses that language quite explicitly, he's preaching the kingdom of God. That's not a little private, sentimental idea. That's of enormous political, social, cultural, economic importance. A new reign is coming. Also, think of Christ coming now in the life of the church. Does it mean a rearrangement of the inner order that obtains in our lives? Yeah, we all have an order. Now, we're sinners, which means it's a kind of a dysfunctional way of ordering things. That old king, that old kingdom has to give way as the new king and the new kingdom arrive. Is that a sentimental business? No, that can be a pretty kind of messy and difficult business, right? As the old order gives way. That's one way, Brandon, I've interpreted the apocalyptic language of the New Testament and the Old Testament too. What's the apocalypse? Well, in a way, it is the end of an old world. It's the old way of ordering things, which is not just dire bad news. It's the preparation for the new order that's coming. That's what Advent and Christmas are all about. It's a revolution. Just one last point. I have made this before in talking about Christmas, but go back to that famous account in St. Luke, right? That begins with the evocation of Augustus and Quirinius and the old established order, which will give way with the arrival of this new baby king who has with him an angelic army. And that's very strong language, meant to signal that a more powerful king has emerged. That's the import of Advent and Christmas.
I want to come back to some of those New Testament passages here in just a moment, but let's spend a little time in the Old Testament. One of the figures that pops up again and again in the Advent and Christmas season, at least in the lectionary readings at Mass, is the great prophet Isaiah. Talk about Isaiah and how he's an Advent figure.
Yeah, he comes up a lot, doesn't he, in the liturgical readings for Advent. And of course, read the Bible scholars on the book of the prophet Isaiah. They divide it very often into three sections. They call it Proto, Deutero, and Trito Isaiah, the three Isaiahs, if you want. The idea there is that what we have as the book of the prophet Isaiah was probably a compilation of texts from different periods, different authors, different audiences. And the Advent side of it really comes through in what they call Deutero Isaiah, the second Isaiah. Think of chapters like 40 through 55 of Isaiah. And that's what we hear from very often in the Advent and the Christmas season. Deutero Isaiah is dealing with the return for the Babylonian exile, this disaster for Israel. Talk about their order giving way and this oppressive kingship arriving, see, with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian exile. But then this marvelous moment when, through the power of God, Israel is called back to its home country, called out of exile, out of this new slavery. That's where Deutero Isaiah comes in, and these beautiful texts of liberation and of preparing the way and of making a highway in the desert. See, all of that is about making a highway so that God may come and then lead his people on this flat highway back to Israel. Well, that makes him an Advent figure, doesn't it? The prophet Isaiah, because we're preparing to be liberated from these forms of slavery that we're in. Now, read that broadly. Read that politically, culturally, ethically, spiritually, all kinds of captivities, right, that we're in. Well, Yahweh's coming. The Lord's coming as the new king. Now make straight a highway for him to facilitate this journey back to the promised land. Now read the promised land spiritually, right? The promised land of a rightly ordered soul. The promised land of salvation. We're being led from sin to salvation. I think that's how the church has read those great texts from especially Deutero Isaiah.
Where else, you alluded to Exodus, and we're talking about Isaiah here. Where else in the Old Testament do we find Advent themes?
Oh, God, in a way, everywhere. You see, in a way, the whole Old Testament is an Advent text, isn't it? I like N.T. Wright's insight that the Old Testament is like this story without an ending. It's a play that hasn't come to its final act. It's all about the expectation of Israel. Once we've lost our way through sin, now think of the text about the expulsion from the garden and all that. But then God plans this great rescue operation in the form of his people Israel, whom he shapes in their mind, in their heart, in their worship, in their ethical behavior. They're meant to draw Israel back to God, and then through Israel, the whole world is meant to be drawn back to God. That's the great story. However, what? It's an open-ended story. It's a story without an ending, because it's clear, though Israel has begun this work, it's been compromised, or it's failed, or it's not achieved the end. And so Israel itself begins to long. Lord, how long? Lord, when will you send the Messiah? Lord, when will you come in person? In a way, the Lord has come, right? He's come to shape his people Israel. He's chosen them and formed them, but yet they're not fulfilling their destiny. So they long for the messianic figure who will sum up and realize the best of Israel and also represent the reign of God over Israel and through Israel, again, for the whole world. That's why I'd read the whole of the Old Testament as an Advent text. It's all saying, come, O Lord, when are you coming? Lord, how long before you come? And then the New Testament is, he came. He's here. He's arrived. The King is here. Now, get on board, everybody. Now the church. See, go from Old Testament to New Testament to the church. We're in the era of, okay, get behind him. The King has arrived, get more and more under his command and his aegis. There's the church in relation to both the New Testament and the Old.
One of the most popular Advent hymns, I think, is probably sung in every parish during Advent, is O come, Emmanuel. And you've always liked those lyrics. Talk a little bit about that hymn.
Yeah, my sense is we all love that haunting melody, don't we? Which is very ancient. It goes back to the first millennium, that melody. And you hear it, and it's wonderful because you say, Advent's come. There's the great Advent hymn. But I wonder how many people actually pay attention to those extraordinary words. O come now, Emmanuel, right? God with us. So they're begging for God to be with us. But then that next line, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here. See, that's the space, Brandon, that spiritually we have to move into. Ransom a captive people. What are we captive to? Well, Israel knew about political captivity. Read the book of Exodus, and then read the accounts of the Babylonian captivity. Read the accounts of the oppression by the Greek invaders. Read the accounts in the New Testament about the Roman invaders. They knew about captivity in the political sense, but they also knew about captivity in the spiritual sense, in the moral sense, that they were in a state that they could not get out of themselves, right? That's why the ransoming of captivity is very important. Let's say you're held captive, but you can manage to escape. When they're not looking, I can get away. That's not the situation we're in. We're being held ransom in such a way that we can't handle the problem ourselves. All we can do is hope for this payment to be made, right? The ransom to be paid. That wonderful word, to redeem. We speak of Christ as the Redeemer, the act of redemption. That just means to buy back. It's within the sort of symbolic context of this captivity. That's our state. Only when we realize that do we begin to look properly for a savior. See, as long as I think I can save myself, which most modern people do, that's an ancient idea as well. See, in the ancient world, sure, if we just get enough clarity of thought and we habituate ourselves properly, we grow in virtue, we can save ourselves. Well, that's all over the place today, isn't it? Get the right self-help book, get the right diet book, figure out your relationships. You'll be fine. You'll be happy. The Bible keeps saying no to that. It's just not going to work. We're more like captives held for ransom. Once we get that, then we start looking for a savior, and we stop playing a game of auto salvation. Oh, I can save myself. No, you can't. And until you realize that, you won't appreciate Jesus as a savior. See, one of the giveaways we've talked about is in the measure that you see Jesus as a guru and a teacher and a spiritual guide, you haven't gotten him because you're still within an auto salvation framework. Oh, yeah, I read Plato, and then I read Confucius, and I read the Sufi mystics, and I read Jesus, and I figured out, oh, here's the right spiritual path. As long as you're playing that game, you're not playing a Christian game. You're not singing, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. You know, that's the importance of that song.
You know, I'm a big time Anglophile, and I know you are a little bit too. And I've been reading lately a lot of the Arthurian legends and Lord of the Rings, and in all of these tales sort of based in the medieval English world, there's this longing for this ancient king who sort of disappeared, and we're sort of waiting for him to come back. But then in America, you know, we both live under this American democracy. I know a lot of our listeners live in all sorts of other political arrangements, but do you think as Americans, it's a little more difficult to sort of move into this space because we don't have the appreciation of ever having a king or longing for a king or anything like that?
Yeah, there's something right about that. See, they're all symbols we're dealing with here. And so within the political framework of a monarchy, of a kingship, they made spiritual sense of what was going on. And it does work there. If you think of God as a president, you're automatically lost. Now, mind you, I like having a president. I don't want to have a king politically. So I'm an American. But see, don't translate that into spiritual language, because a president is someone that is beholden to us finally. We can vote him in, vote him out, right? And that can't be true of God. God is more like a king, right, who commands us. We don't command him. And then you're right, that wonderful motif of the return of the king, right? We find in Tolkien and in many others. You're right. When the king comes back to us and establishes right order, we're going to find the harmony that we need. We can't prompt it. We don't kind of build our way up to it. We're waiting for the return of the king. That's more biblical kind of language. And they use their own political arrangements to symbolize that spiritual truth. But the spiritual truth remains the same, even as our political situation has changed.
Here's something that I hear from a lot of my friends and some of our Word on Fire listeners. I think most Catholics have a pretty good sense of what they're supposed to do during Lent. You know, we know we're supposed to give up things. We're supposed to increase our almsgiving, our fasting, our prayers, all that kind of stuff. What are we supposed to do during Advent? What recommendations do you have?
You know, go back to Isaiah and John the Baptist, who repeats that language, is make straight a highway for the Lord. Every mountain must be brought low, every valley filled in. Well, think about that. That's the preparation of the straight road to facilitate the arrival of the king, and then the king leading his people back to the promised land. Now, think of it spiritually. Mountains, what do they stand for? Well, I love mountains, but in the traveling context, mountains aren't your friends, right? Because that means you got to really labor to get over these things. And then every mountain creates ipso facto a valley. They're mutually implicative. What makes the spiritual journey difficult? What makes the arrival of Christ difficult? Some things in our lives are exaggerated. They're like mountains. Other things, therefore, are like valleys that are under-stressed. Prepare in Advent this way. Figure out what's a mountain right now in my life. What's something that's overstressed, that's exaggerated, that's making the arrival of Jesus difficult? It might be, look, I'm too caught up in money. I'm too caught up in my career. I'm too caught up in my own pride. Or, you know, those are good things, but even more so, I'm too caught up in my family and my family's success or whatever. In the measure that these things have become too dominant, they're like mountains that have to be leveled, right? Now, concomitantly, every mountain creates a valley. What are things in my life that are undervalued, that are making the journey of Jesus difficult? Am I praying sufficiently? If not, fill in that valley. Am I doing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy? If not, fill in that valley. Is there some besetting sin in my life? And all of us sinners know what that might be. That's a valley. See, it's a lack that's hindering the arrival of Jesus. Fill it in during Advent. So think of Isaiah and John the Baptist. Level the mountains, fill in the valleys, make a highway for the Lord's arrival.
Let me close with this question. What does Advent look like for a bishop? You've had 2 or 3 of these Advents now under your belt as a bishop. What does that look like? Are you visiting multiple parishes through the season? Yeah. How do you celebrate it?
Well, first of all, I'd say what I just said to everybody. As I was saying those words, I was thinking, okay, what's that in your life? What are the mountains and the valleys? So as Augustus said, I'm a bishop for you. I'm a Christian with you, right? I mean, I'm a Christian, and so I try to practice all that. But in a liturgical sense, yeah, I tend to go around to different parishes. I've always loved the Advent season. I think it's beautiful. A couple of years ago, I did an Advent evening of reflection for my region. We just kind of opened it up when I first arrived here and invited people. I think I'm doing something like that as well this year. It's a good time, meditative time, like a retreat. To get ready for the day of Christmas. The trouble is we all know in our culture, we just get so caught up in all the foo-foo around Christmas that we don't prepare ourselves spiritually. Figure out the mountains and the valleys, and then do what you can about that.
Well, that means it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Every episode, we take a question from our listeners from around the world. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com, and we might choose your question for one of these episodes. Today, we got a question from Matthew, who lives in New York, and he's asking about slavery in the Bible. Here's Matthew's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Matthew. I'm from New York. And my question is this: how does an evangelist sort of wrestle with the issue of slavery in the Bible?
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And what I would do, Matthew, is I'd back up first and look at the thing broadly. I think before at random one of these shows, I made that distinction that William Plaker made between what's in the Bible and what the Bible teaches. Plaker observed that there are a lot of things that are in the Bible that are kind of along for the ride culturally. That's to say that they're just kind of in the mind and hearts of the biblical authors, but they're not really the focus of the Bible's teaching. So therefore, it's a problem to say, oh, look, there's something that's in the Bible, therefore it's what the Bible's teaching, or therefore what God wants us to know. So I'd first make that distinction. And the slavery question is an interesting one because, as you know, certainly in our country, but elsewhere around the world, biblical people took different positions. There were sincerely biblical people in our country in the 19th century who said, no, on the basis of the Bible, I think we can defend slavery. Others, think of the early, abolitionists and then their army of followers that said, no, on biblical grounds, slavery is an offense to God. I would say what the abolitionists who won the day happily figured out was the great pattern and themes and trajectories of the Bible moved in the direction of the abolition of slavery. If you look at the great trajectories of the whole Bible, that it's moving in the direction of, liberation and the deep dignity of the individual, that everyone's called to freedom in Christ, etc., that won the day over the mentions of slavery that can be found indeed in the Bible. The determination, I would say, certainly of the Catholic Church in the long run of its history is that the Bible was not teaching slavery. It was teaching really the abolition of slavery. But we have to look at those broader, grander trajectories and themes to get at what the Bible is actually teaching. That's a quick answer to, you're raising a famously controversial issue.
Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Word on Fire show. Listen, as the year wraps up, we'd like to ask your help. As we move into 2019, we're wondering if you could help support the mission of Word on Fire and help us keep producing all of these great resources, from our articles and videos to our podcasts and daily reflections. Just go to wordonfireshow.com/giving, and you can help us continue this work into the new year. So again, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.